Okay, can everyone hear me? At least the crew that can respond. Am I unmuted now, Leo? And okay, so you can hear me. Are my slides
Yes,
visible?
you can be heard, Bruce.
And my slides are also visible?
Yes.
Okay, just want to double check before we roll in. I want to thank Randy for that introduction. There's so much to talk about and so much to say. I put out Twitter threads both on today's topic for this discussion this morning. I also put out a Twitter thread kind of interpreting what went on in the Detroit case, and that kind of this idea that there might be some federal constitutional right to at least some minimal level of education, a door that had been left open kind of through years of other case law. But I'm going to jump into this topic, and I'm going to try to do so from somewhat of a hopeful perspective of what can we do to, at the very least, make things less bad than they might be otherwise, given these very difficult circumstances that we're facing. And some of this requires hitting some prerequisite knowledge, but really the focal point of this brief that we put out this morning, and I won't try to get into all the details of it, is to talk about what we've learned from the way we've dealt with past recessions, and the aftermath of those recessions and recovery periods, regarding equity and adequacy of state school finance systems. We know that public school funding is largely left as a responsibility to the states. It's about, on average across states, it's about a 45-10, 45% local money, 45% state, and 10% federal money, that kind of creates this layer cake of revenues that support our public schooling systems. And there are some disadvantages to that complexity. There turn out to also be some advantages, all of which kind of lead to lessons for how we deal with these recessionary periods, lessons which we can learn from past recessions, at the intersection of what the federal government can do and how state and local governments are able to respond based on the types of tax revenue sources that support our K-12 schools. I'll probably be spending most of my time focusing on what happened in that kind of recession that started around 07-08 and seemed to have had its greatest effect on K through 12 revenues from 2009 to 2011. And we have some detailed recommendations in the report, in the brief we put out this morning, on what types of things we should think about doing this time around to structure the right package to minimize the damage and to keep us on the right path as the economy starts to recover. Just some prerequisite information about state systems that's in the front end of the brief. Some districts in any given state, from lowest to highest poverty, which tends to be somewhat related to lowest to highest capacity to raise your own local revenues based on property taxes. Some districts are more dependent on state aid than others. Higher need districts depend more on money from state sources than lower need districts. And ideally, a well-structured state school finance system will also be putting more money in the aggregate into districts and students that have greater needs to be able to provide them with equal opportunity to achieve common outcome goals. And we could spend a whole lot of time on that assumption and topic alone. That's addressed in the brief. It's also addressed in related work that we have on the Shanker Institute website in the School Finance Indicators data system. But suffice it to say, some districts have greater needs, need more money to begin with to provide equal opportunity to their kids. Many of those same districts have less capacity to support those needs on their own and are therefore more dependent on state aid. State aid tends to come from a mix of income and sales tax revenue. All sales tax in the states with no income tax, and all more income tax in the states with less sales tax. Local revenue tends to come from property tax revenue, which is where we do see a lot of the greatest underlying disparities in our school funding system. But I'm actually going to talk about some virtues of the property tax a little later on, and some ideas of how we might creatively tap property taxes for their advantages while avoiding some of the disadvantages. So we've got this complex kind of layer cake. This is really based on, roughly on New Jersey level data. The federal slice is pretty small. It's bigger in higher need districts. And that's mostly, driven by the Title I allocations that go out to school districts. Now, quick look at state and local revenue over time. And this is a theme coming out of the last recession, that per pupil, if we adjust for changes in labor costs over time, and we explain, why we want to do that as opposed to adjusting for the change in the price of a loaf of bread or gallon of gas. Schools are run on labor and maintenance of competitive wages, which Sylvia could certainly talk extensively about, is what's going to help us keep the quality of workforce we need to run schools. When we adjust for the changes in labor costs over time, state and local revenue per pupil never fully rebounded from the last recession, on average across states. States went in a lot of different directions on this. Some did, more or less recover or more, but most did not. And that puts us in a more difficult position as we enter this potential recession, which is likely to be much even larger than we were in as we entered the last recession. The effects were different across districts, and actually author David Knight has an exceptional article on this, which was summarized in a piece that Matt Barnum from Chalkbeat put up yesterday, that districts that are higher in child poverty concentration took a bigger hit during that last recession. And by the end of the period of federally available data, which is 2017, they still hadn't fully rebounded, and they were further from fully rebounding than other districts. They were not back to their high water marks. So those districts that took the bigger hit are going into this next recessionary period in a more precarious position than they entered the last. If they take an equivalent or even larger hit this time around, we're going to find ourselves in even more dire situations in high poverty districts. We're going to be probably seeing more kind of piggyback arguments at the level of what was brought in Detroit about even being able to achieve minimum literacy standards if we continue to deprive these districts in each cycle of recession as we go. This graph, this is kind of a messy, confusing, crazy graph, but it shows something to me that was really, really striking. And that is that these dots are each the predicted level of spending per pupil in high poverty districts in every state. And what happened as we hit the recession is this incredible divergence, this fanning out of states. Most states were kind of moving upward in their investment in higher poverty districts prior to 2007. They were spreading out a little bit because a few, like New Jersey, were really escalating funding into higher poverty districts, but they hadn't really, there was disparity between states, but that disparity goes kind of chaotic and haywire once you hit that recession. The recession hits, states implement austerity measures, they implement huge cuts, they cut to deeper amounts in higher poverty districts, and after the recession, many of them keep going with cuts. And we see this incredible spreading out, this kind of new era of interstate disparity in school funding as some states continue to disinvest in public schooling while other states start to try to recover from the recession. It's really striking to me to see how much this fans out from the recession, from the last recession forward, and it would be a particularly disturbing situation to see it, accelerate through this next recession. Again, if we take the weighted average of actual district per pupil spending adjusted for labor costs over time, most states by 2017 were spending less than they were in 2007. Some states a lot less. These numbers are slightly different than the consumer price index adjusted numbers put out by the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, but the order and rank of the states is relatively similar, and they too show huge cuts in some states like Arizona and Oklahoma over what those states had been spending 10 years prior. And these are cuts that came about through the past recession. Imagine, what would happen if we face an even greater recession this time around with states that are 15, 20% below where they were 10 years ago. It's really unthinkable. Now, just kind of tying this in, the money, and this should be kind of a no-brainer. I read about this in a lot of my articles. The money that's there, it translates to tangible resources. It translates to staffing ratios and competitive wages for teachers. We are down, and Matt DiCarlo put some really nice examples of, how much it looks like a pretty subtle downward shift in the numbers of teachers per 100 kids, but that has real classroom effects. We're down from pre-last recession at a new equilibrium that's at a lower level. If we get hit again, we're likely to have those ratios of staff driven down further. It also, well, I actually thought I had another one. Another piece of this puzzle is that the competitiveness of teacher wages tends to catch up a little bit during bad economic times because others' wages aren't growing, but we really squandered the period after that when other wages were growing and we didn't reinvest in schools. Teacher wages fell further and further behind, and it comes down to this, that our new equilibrium on the percent of our economic capacity that we are spending on schools is lower than it's been compared to, let's say, other periods where we might say there was an equilibrium. We're spending less of our economic capacity on education. I could take this back to the 1970s and show that it's an unprecedented low level, whether we measure it by percent of personal income or percent of gross state product across states. We are now at a new low equilibrium that we never recovered back to the mid-2000s or even the mid-1990s level of the proportion of our capacity to spend. This is a policy choice. We spend less on schools because we've chosen to, not because we've tapped out our economic capacity. We're spending less and less of our economic capacity on K through 12 schools. In addition to that, we're just spending less and less on all public services. Our taxes as a percent of income in general and our state and local revenues as a percent of income in general are down over the long haul. And that number, if we go backwards to the 70s, goes up and up and up. We're at unprecedentedly low levels of our state and local taxation as a percent of our capacity to support. We've got a lot more capacity to support a robust system of public programs and services, one of the largest pieces of which is K through 12 public schooling. It's been on a consistent decline over time. Here's where I'm going to transition to a little bit of this layer cake of revenue sources that fuel public education. This is going to lead us to some insights on how we might approach a remedy, or how we might approach this, federal aid packages for this next recessionary period, and how state and local governments can also figure out best to respond. It's income tax revenues. Different tax revenue sources have different degrees of volatility. Income tax revenues are most volatile. Of course, if you're a state that has no income tax, you're less susceptible to that volatility. It also turns out that states where a larger share of income tax revenues are generated by non-wage income are even more volatile, in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and California. And that volatility is going to affect state general fund budgets, which is likely then to have a significant effect on what's available to provide in state aid to schools. Sales tax revenues are kind of second in volatility to income tax revenues. Property tax revenues are usually very stable and serve to counterbalance. And that's why having this balanced portfolio of revenues can help to secure the future of school funding. We just got to figure out how to best mix them over time. Property tax revenues took a hit in the last recession because it was a recession driven by a housing bubble and a real estate bubble. If you look to even the early 2000s recession, property tax revenues continued to grow, in fact, because of the emerging bubble during that period, even while income tax revenues had a pretty sharp dip. In that kind of post 9/11 recession. Property tax revenues can serve as a buffer. They have a virtue. As much as property taxes are kind of a root cause of educational inequality, they're stable. When they do decline, they decline in a lag, off cycle with other losses. so they can buffer the effects of other losses. And there are creative ways to use property taxation as a redistributional tool. In fact, California's got a referendum on the ballot that would apply market rates to taxation of commercial and industrial properties and then tax those properties for statewide redistribution. It's actually based on academic articles written by Sonny Ladd in the 90s and also Brian Brent. More is in our brief on that. Going to skip over this one. When we look at the application of, if the federal government wanted to step in and provide stimulus aid as they did previously with the fiscal stabilization aid, that would be aid meant to offset a portion of these red bars. It's to kind of counterbalance what's lost in state aid. And in the last stimulus, it was correct of them to ask states to run it through your general formula, to say, put that yellow slice in to replace portions of the red that were lost. That meant that the yellow slice, the federal stabilization funding for a 2-year period, was greater in higher need, higher poverty, lower capacity districts. What they didn't protect against was what happens after the second year when that money is gone. States had choices of how they reduced aid, but most states took it out in the same pattern that they put it in, which meant that if you ran that federal stabilization money through your general aid formula to provide more to greater need, lower capacity districts, when you cut the aid, states typically cut it in larger amounts from districts with greater needs. And that really significantly reduced any progressiveness, if there was any, of school funding in a number of states. So, the last fiscal stabilization package rightfully, suggested to states run it through your general aid formula, but they didn't protect against the possibility that would then lead to bigger cuts from higher need districts after the fact. In addition to that, 2 years was too short. If you look at the shape, and this is all in our brief, you look at the shape of the drop in income tax revenue, it drops sharply in the first year, stays in the bottom, stays down at the low for the second year, and then slowly climbs back. So with only a 2-year package, it was certainly going to lead to a cliff that districts were going to fall off in the subsequent year. As districts fell off the cliff, it's interesting. I had done a blog post, which I think is linked in our brief, grading the governor's cuts that happened in 2011 when the fiscal stabilization money ran out. And many governors, because the money went in to the regular formula, when it was gone, just took bigger cuts from the higher need districts. Philadelphia, Allentown, places like that in Pennsylvania got hammered. New York State took the biggest cuts out of the higher need districts. You could have done it, actually New Jersey did it as 5% of budgets instead of as percent of state aid. That at least made for even cuts across. These little yellow bars come out to, if you did it as 5% of everyone's budget, it's $500 something per pupil. But if you do it as a percent of their state aid for the same total amount, it goes from 100 and something for the lowest need districts to almost $1,000 per pupil cut to the highest need districts. There are better ways to cut, and any federal stimulus package should be providing guidance, if there are cuts, on how those can or should be distributed. But a federal package should be sufficient to avoid those cuts. We lay out in the report some guidelines for how we should approach a stimulus package, pointing out that there's going to be a sharp drop in year one. We're probably still going to be at the bottom in year two, but there's probably a need for a year 3, 4, 5 phase down package to avoid that cliff. But there's also a need for some other kind of protective guidance to states on things that they need to do to make sure that the districts serving the neediest student populations, the districts with the least capacity of their own, don't end up hurting those districts more once the federal aid is gone. And there were a couple things that happened that really should be protected against. One is those disproportionate cuts to higher need districts. Two is that we need to protect against states just continuing to lower their overall effort. Colorado, Arizona, Oklahoma, a number of states simply have driven their school systems into the tank on effort. We also need to protect, one of the things that really caused some persistent damage in the aftermath were states that adopted austerity measures, put caps on property taxes, which is, that's your compensating mechanism. And if you're cutting state aid and then capping the compensating mechanism, you are necessarily going to inflict damage. It's like tying one hand behind your back. New York State took it an extra level. They actually tied both hands behind their back by self-inflicting a 2% cap on the growth of the state budget during the recovery period. So property taxes were capped, so districts couldn't compensate. And then the state budget was capped, so the state couldn't increase aid for the lack of the fact that districts couldn't compensate. So New York State tied both hands behind its back. Any federal aid package should include some requirements that states put up their own effort, lift it back to pre-recession equilibrium, pre-last recession, and that states don't adopt and force these other measures that limit their ability to recover. That's a large part of the reason why many states and many districts and states never recovered. We, in our paper, we talk about having a two-phase process. Yes, it should be equalized for local capacity. It's got to be targeted for need. The cuts should not be patterned to remove it in the same way. And there really shouldn't be austerity measures that keep states from ever fully recovering. We also talk about some of these kind of creative policy ideas, like using the property tax more broadly to improve equity as opposed to what it usually does. States can't continue business as usual. They got to step up. We need to restore and increase fiscal effort that needs to be targeted toward providing progressive school funding. That brings us back to our other report from the School Finance Indicators data system. And balanced revenue portfolios are important. The property tax, as much as we hate it, has its virtues. It's just a matter of figuring out how to structure these revenues and deliver the aid in a way that provides for an equitable and adequate system that's resilient through these types of economic cycles and downturns. And I believe that's it. It's my Rutgers email and the Shanker Institute URL. I've probably gone over time, but we'll turn it over from there. I will unshare my screen and send it back to you guys.